to go over linked lists. I'm just gonna wait a couple more minutes for more people to join. Seems like we still have some people trying to join. Yeah, but otherwise, how is everybody doing? I had a nightmare yesterday where I dreamt that I forgot to come and teach this lesson. And I woke up and I looked at my alarm clock and it said Tuesday. And I was like, it's Tuesday and I haven't taught my lesson yet. And I was like, oh, it's Tuesday, 1 a.m. So I'm okay. Hopefully, the nightmare never becomes true. But that's literally my worst nightmare. I'm just going to wait like 2 more minutes for everybody to get a chance to join before we officially start. First thing that I think is really cool is if you have checked out our Slack channel recently. So Karina is one of the instructors that you met in the first week, and she's coming back in week 5 and week 12. But she set up this really cool thing because a lot of students were talking about how they wish they had the opportunity to meet more people in the class because you're mostly just talking with the people in your group right now, right? And that's only like 5 out of the 200 other students that are in this class. So she set up 2 really cool things. So the first one is Donut, and this is a thing that randomly pairs you up with someone else in the class. So you opt into the service called Donut, and then you join the Slack channel that we created. And once you're opted in, this service basically pairs you up with someone random every Monday and Wednesday, I think. And then the 2 of you can just kind of chat and do some icebreakers. So we have a list of suggested icebreakers that and questions that we give to you, so that if you're trying to meet someone and you don't know what to talk about, we give you a list of topics to talk about. So Donut is really cool because it lets you kind of meet more people in a more intimate way. So it's just a one-on-one meeting. And you could try it out for like the first time and see how it goes. You could say, for example, I don't want to meet these people because they're already in my group, and the service is going to be automatically able to pair you up with someone else. So Donut is really cool. Check that out if you're interested in meeting people virtually and having like a virtual hangout with somebody. If you're not available on Wednesdays, you could say, hey, I only want this on Mondays. So I think we set up 2 options where you could do this on Mondays or Wednesdays. So that's really cool. Check it out. This is the first time we're trying it out. So if you do it and you end up having a good experience or having a bad experience, feel free to reach out to us and let us know how that went. The second thing that I think is also really cool is this thing called push pull. So this is basically a way for you to create a profile, and you could talk about things that you're good at and your services that you're able to offer other students. For example, I could say, hey, I'd be up for reviewing your resume and telling you like what I like about it, what I don't like about it, or I'm really good at linked lists, for example. If you need help with linked lists, reach out to me. Or sorry, my dog is going crazy. Can you hear my dog barking? He's going crazy. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, the second thing you could do is say, hey, I want help with this thing, and then you could say, hey, I need help with, for example, binary trees, or I need help with mock interviewing. And so push pull is really cool. So you can set up your profile and be able to say, hey, I could help with this kind of stuff, or I need help with this kind of stuff. So I'm going to share what our feed looks like right now, so you get an idea of what that looks like. So this is what it looks like once you actually join push pull. So you fill out a little form that says, hey, I'm good at this, I can help with this. Or you say, hey, I would like help with this, or I would like suggestions for this. And then we created this little CodePath community for this class. And you can say, hey, look at all these different things that people are able to help out with, and all these different things that people want help with. So for example, like I'm pretty good at Android. So I say, hey, if you're interested about learning for Android, like feel free to contact me about that. Karina is really good at building teams and giving like a good team culture. So if you're interested about how to do that for maybe a startup that you're working at, you could reach out to Karina. So Karina has all this stuff that she's good at, that she's able to help you out with, introducing you to people at Google or Facebook or Airbnb. And then on the other side, you have all these things that people are looking to get better at. So for example, Karina is looking for more startup ideas that maybe other people can suggest to her. I'm looking for more book recommendations. So the idea is that we build this little community inside push pull. And once you are able to fill in, hey, these are the stuff I'm able to help out with, and this is the stuff that I want some help with, then we could all look at this community that we have built and see what kind of things people in our community are good at. see how we can help other people in our community and just create this big old helpful community. So push pull I think is really cool. It's not involved in like virtually meeting people. So if you're a little shy about, hey, I don't really want to talk to someone through Zoom for like an hour or something, push pull is a good way to meet other people without having to actually do that. So these are all in the Slack channel that I'm just gonna share my screen again. So this is all instructions for how to get involved with all this is all in the Slack channel. So if you haven't already, check that out and definitely at least create the push pull profile, because I think that will at least help everybody get to know everybody else a little better. Any questions about the two of those things so far? Cool. Yeah, so this is the first time we're trying both of these. So we'll see how it goes. It was really cool. Maybe we can help bring it other ideas into this as well, so that everybody gets a chance to meet everybody else in the class. The second thing I kind of wanted to talk about was hacker ranks. So how do people feel after having taken 2 hacker ranks so far? You're like, this is way too easy. I'm way more advanced in this class, or I don't really get hacker ranks. I wish I had more time to study. Okay, so the good news is hopefully people have been finding the hacker ranks for the first 2 weeks very manageable. Hopefully you're not having too much trouble with it. The bad news is things are going to start picking up really fast after weeks 4 and 5. So this next hacker rank is hopefully still very manageable, but things will start picking up more and more. We're kind of letting everybody get more warmed up. But the thing to keep in mind is even if you got a really good score on a hacker rank, still take the time to go over the solutions guide, because there might be some things that you missed, or there might be some extra things that you could learn from the solutions guide. And also don't get too stressed out about the score. The score is mostly a way for you to kind of gauge whether you need more time to study or if there's specific topics that you need to brush up on. Oh yeah, the solution guides. The solution guides, I'll share in the Slack channel later, but we have this resources page, and the solution guides are posted there where we recap every question and then also tell you what the answer that we expected every question is. And then some questions have explanations for the answers as well. Yeah, so if you remember, please do prepend your group number in front of your name so that we could more easily put you in your breakout rooms. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to have a good experience when we start the breakout rooms. Any questions about hacker ranks other than the solutions guide? So I'm going to post the links to the solution guides in Slack channel later. But yeah, are there any questions about hacker ranks so far? No, I don't think you've gotten the score for this week's yet because you just finished it yesterday. Okay, cool. So it looks like there's no more questions about hacker ranks. Everybody is feeling pretty good about them. In that case, we're going to move on to what we're going to focus on for the next 2 weeks, which is linked lists. So linked list is actually one of my least favorite type of problems. I used to be really scared when I walk into interviews. I'd be like, give me anything but a linked list problems. And I think that's because linked list is one of those data structures that I just don't use very often. It's not something that, it's not like strings or arrays where you use it all the time when you're programming. Linked list is one of those tricky things where unless you're building something really complicated, it's something that might not come up as often and something you definitely are not going to use day to day. But I think linked list questions are really interesting because they really show how you think through a problem and if you're able to talk through your technical solution. And the idea is that you might not use linked lists a lot in the real world, right? But if we just spend 2 weeks really learning about linked lists and really getting comfortable with it, hopefully we won't have to worry about it ever again. So just think of the next 2 weeks as, hey, I'm just going to dedicate these 2 weeks to getting really good at linked lists. I'm going to master it, and then I won't have to ever worry about it or be scared of getting a linked list question again. So kind of summing it up, actually, if a 5-year-old asked you what linked list was, how would you explain to that 5-year-old? So I love these questions where like, hey, explain linked list to me like I'm a 5-year-old. So if I asked you to explain linked list to me like I'm a 5-year-old, what would you say? Oh, these are great. A train with connectors, snake leg, Legos, a bunch of people holding hands. Yeah, these are awesome. These are great answers. So yeah, I kind of think of linked lists as segments of train where there's connectors between each segment too. So basically, kind of boiling down what linked lists are and what we actually care about, linked lists are basically just individual elements, right? So these nodes that hold two pieces of information. So each specific part of a linked list, each node only knows one, the kind of data it holds. So the data can depend on how the linked list is implemented itself. It can either hold integers, it can hold strings, it can literally hold anything, right? It can even hold hash maps if you wanted to. The second thing that it knows is a reference to the next node. So the important thing to keep in mind is each node literally only has these two pieces of information. It knows the data it's holding, and it has a reference to the next node that it points to. So kind of drawing it out, it looks something like this. So hopefully this is all mostly a review for most people, and this isn't like brand new information. That's why I'm going through it kind of fast. I'm just kind of giving a very brief overcap of linked lists. So hopefully this is not brand new information for everybody. Usually, so this is the Java code for what an implementation of a linked list node is. So like we kind of said before, it knows two things. One, it has the data that it holds, and the other thing is it has reference to the next node that it points to. So this is literally all the implementation of a linked list node is. And so if we were trying to actually build out this linked list in that picture, it will look something like this. We create the individual nodes, right? We create an individual node for A, we create a node for B and C and D. And once we created those individual nodes, next thing we have to do is actually connect them, right? So we have to set the next pointer for each node to point to the next node that we want it to be connected to. Hopefully this makes sense for everybody. Is anybody not too familiar with linked lists, or has everybody already gotten a pretty good, learned about linked lists in your data structures class already? Hopefully this is all review. Review from one person. Okay, hopefully this is all review, but we do have guides on linked lists if you are not so comfortable with it. And the thing about linked lists is, I think, even though I have learned it already, I feel like I always have to kind of review it just because I use it so little, right? So even if this is kind of review, hopefully this is useful because this is just something that it doesn't come up too often. So the most important thing I like to ask for every data structure is, why is it useful, right? Like, why are we even studying this data structure? So does anybody have ideas about where linked lists are actually used in the real world? Like, why do we even have this data structure? Cool, yeah, caches, web pages, queues, helps implement hash maps, memory efficient. Yeah, these are all exactly the kind of things I kind of thought of too. So one, your web browser history. So those little arrows that you see in your web browser, where you could go to the last page you visited and then you could go back to the next page. This is basically implemented in a linked list. And it's implemented with linked lists because it's very easy to have the next pointer in your linked list, right? It's very easy to keep a reference to the last pointer and keep a whole stack of the previous web pages you have visited. So linked lists are used to implement web browsers histories. Second thing is memory management. So the way memory management works is there's blocks of memories that you can use. And then once some block of memory hasn't been accessed in a long time, you don't want to keep that around forever, right? You want to free up space so that you can use it for new memory that is actually useful to you right now. So the way that that's managed and how the computer figures out, hey, which block can I use to boot it and put in new stuff, is also used with the linked list. So that's very important. Thing that you kind of learned last week was that some hash tables, depending on how the implementation of the hash table works, also can be used with linked lists. So linked lists are used to resolve collisions. So if you're trying to put something in a hash table and it ends up in the same index in the hash table, what happens is the value will get added to a linked list at the end. So it's another way for how hash tables are implemented. These are all like just general stuff. You don't have to memorize this. This might be good to know just generally, but probably 99% of the time, nobody is going to ask you how to implement a hash table using linked lists. So these are just general information that's just fun to know, something that I think is interesting to know and makes me want to learn about the data structure a little more instead of just, hey, I'm studying for interviews. So there are actually different types of linked lists. So a lot of people have mentioned, hey, what kind of linked lists are you studying? So what are some types of linked lists? Yeah, we got double A linked lists, we got single A linked lists. circle linked lists. Yeah, so basically everybody is really familiar with these type of linked lists already, hopefully. So there's singly linked lists, and what that means is that each node only has one pointer to the next node. Or there's something called double linked lists, which is, hey, one node knows the next node. It also knows the previous node if it has any. So this is the specific application where it's useful for web pages, right? Because each node has a pointer to its next node and also the previous node. So you can imagine each of these elements in the linked list is a web page, and it creates this history of all the web pages that you have actually visited. There's also a circular linked list, which is where the last node points to the first node again. So these are 3 different types of linked lists. But really, when you get an interview question, you should always assume, or you shouldn't assume it's a single link. You should always ask, hey, for this interview question, are we assuming this list is singly linked, doubly linked? But most of the time, for the problem you're going to be solving, the list is going to be singly linked. And the reason for that is because questions become a lot easier if it's doubly linked, because then you have a previous pointer and you have a next pointer. But it's a lot harder to solve problems when it's just singly linked. Does that kind of make sense? Cool. I'm going through everything really fast, so feel free to ask questions. If you have questions about anything, if anything's confusing in any way. So the other thing that we want to really think about whenever we study a new data structure is to think about the pros and cons of each data structure, right? Because this is where you're going to have to put on your thinking cap when an interviewer presents you with a question. You have to go through your mental model of all the data structures that you know, and you think through all of them and figure out, hey, for this question, should I use a hash map? Should I use linked list? Should I use a tree? So this is where you have to kind of figure out, hey, what are the pros and cons of each data structure that we're using? And this is how you figure out, hey, this is the reason I should use this, or this is the reason I shouldn't use this. So whenever you're trying to choose a data structure for your problem, you always think about, hey, this data structure is good because it performs better in time, or data structure is good because it's more space efficient. So the good things about linked lists is it's really easy to insert or delete from one end, right? Because you have the nodes that point to each other. So inserting into the end of a linked list is really easy, as opposed to an array. You might have to iterate through the whole array. It's really bad because when you're trying to search through a linked list, you can only search through it one by one, right? So worst case scenario, you have to go through the whole linked list just to search for it. Versus an array, you can immediately access a specific index. Does that kind of make sense? So say you're searching for something in a linked list, you can immediately access, for example, the 4th node in the linked list. But in an array, you can do that. But in an array, if you're trying to insert something inside the middle of an array, now you're gonna have to push everything in the array to the left or to the right, right? Versus a linked list, you could just add that extra node and then repoint it to the next pointer so that you're inserting it in the middle. So those are kind of the pros and cons for linked lists, and hopefully that kind of helps you think about which data structure to use when a problem is presented. We also have these really cool guides. I don't know if we mentioned this before, so how many people are already aware that we have these computer science guides? We link to this in our resources page sometimes. But these are really useful because it basically goes over all the data structures that we're going to talk about. And then it goes over the pros and cons of each data structure. And it kind of gives you examples of when those specific data structures might be useful. Yep, so we do have guides.codepath.org/compsci. And there's a bunch of guides about all these data structures and how they're useful. So definitely check that out if you want maybe just like a recap of what we talked about, or a recap of the pros and cons of each data structure. So for today, we're really just getting warmed up with linked lists, right? Because nobody just works with linked lists all the time. So for today, we're just going to kind of get our brains warmed up with linked lists and get familiar with, hey, working with linked lists, thinking about linked list problems. So really just focusing on the understand step. So just kind of quick recap. You really want to spend some time in the beginning when the interviewer first asks you a question, really understanding the question, right? Because you don't want to solve the wrong question. And you want to make sure that you clarify all the edge cases that the interviewer is looking for. Because it's very often that interviewer is going to give you a very vague question to start with, right? So you want to ask clarifying questions such as, hey, is this input possible? Will this input always be sorted? Or are there any space and time constraints we're dealing with? Or given this X input, what is the expected Y output? So for today's group exercise, we're really just going to think about linked list problems together just for understanding the problem. So these are the 4 things that you want to do for your group exercise today. 1, you want to write out the method step for the problem. So what kind of input does this method take in, and what kind of output are we expecting? You want to list out 3 different input and output examples, like a short input, a long input, and edge cases. And if you think there's more edge cases that you should clarify, definitely list those as well. And then any other clarifying questions that you need. So this is going to be the meat of our group exercise for today. The goal really is just to have enough information so that when you're actually going to solve the problem, you don't have any other questions that might come up, right? But you don't need to know how you're going to solve it at all. You don't even have to have a general idea of how you might solve it. You don't need to think about, hey, I need to solve it in this way. You're really just trying to figure out and gather all the requirements for this first step. Okay, so we're going to do some examples together. And these examples that we're doing together is basically going to be what you're going to do in your group together later. So the first example is we're given this question, reverse a singly linked list. So I'm going to give everybody a chance. What kind of questions would you ask if you were given this question? So this was actually the first interview question I ever got when I started interviewing for a position. And I had no idea how to do this question. I was like, I know what linked lists are. I know what singly linked lists are. I have no idea how to reverse it. So yeah, what are some questions? And this is me going into my first ever technical interview, and I had no idea what to do with. So I did the wrong thing where I immediately started to write code, right? And I was like, I have no idea what I'm writing. But what I should have started by doing was asking some clarifying questions. So I'm asking everybody what kind of clarifying questions you would have for this question right now. So can the list be empty? Yeah, that's a good question. Can we get an empty list? If it's an empty list, what do we want to return? Are we just returning the head of the new list, or are we returning the head of the original list that we reversed? Do we have to do this in place? Can we use a double-A linked list, which would be amazing. But let's assume this is a single-A linked list and we can't make it double. Can we use other data structures to help us solve this problem? Can we edit the original list? Yeah, so these are all great questions. So these are the questions that I came up with. One is, should our method return a new node, right? So this is important because if we can return a new node, then we can build a new linked list, right? Versus if we can't return a new node, what we have to do is reverse this linked list in place, which means that we can't create any extra data. The second thing I kind of want to do is just write out something to make sure that I understand the answer to that question. So I want to write out my method signature just to clarify with the interviewer, hey, this is what the method should take in as an input, and this is what the method should output. So because our method should not return a new node, what I know is that this method should not return anything, right? That's where the void comes from. And because I know that this method is taking a linked list node, I kind of verify it here. Does that kind of make sense so far? Cool, and that's why this first step of kind of understanding and writing out these method signature is important, because one, you tease out, hey, are you trying to do this in place, or are you able to create new data? So being able to write out that method signature really helps clarify a lot of questions with the interviewer. So now I'm kind of trying to come up with some example inputs and outputs, right? So given 1, do we return 1? And I would assume yes, we return 1. Given 1, 2, 3, should we return 3, 2, 1? And I would assume yes, the interviewer is yes, that makes sense. Given 1, 1, 1, do we return 1, 1, 1? And I assume the interviewer say yes, because it's the same list. And even though we don't know it's the same list, it returns it reversed, which looks the same. And then my last question is, hey, can we use some extra space for it? So even though I already said that, hey, we have to do this in place, I'm kind of still thinking, hey, is there any like wiggle room for it where I could use some extra space with it? So these are just questions I'm trying to ask right now. And it doesn't even really matter when you're doing this in your group what the answer is, but these are just a list of questions that you think you need to ask in order to really solve this problem correctly. The last question I have is, hey, do we have to do it in one pass? Can I take multiple passes through a linked list, or do I just have to do it once? So that was all the questions I have for that. Does that make sense? So this is kind of like the same exercise you would go through with your group as well. Kind of asking clarifying questions. And once you've asked all your clarifying questions, trying to write out the method signature so what the method takes in and what the method outputs. And then 3, giving some example inputs and outputs if there's any edge cases. Is there any edge cases for this that people think we should clarify? Empty list. Yeah, I think an empty list, we would return an empty list as well. It's a good one. I always forget about the empty. A list with multiple types. That's interesting. So if each node can hold different types of data. So let's assume that if we're trying to reverse this linked list, all the nodes hold the same kind of data. So either holds all strings or it holds all integers. Duplicate elements. Yeah, let's assume there can be duplicate elements, kind of given the example I have with 111 and 111. Okay, cool. One last example before everybody goes and does their own. So the second example is, hey, let's remove duplicates from a linked list, right? So the first question I had is, hey, do we want to return a new list or do we need to delete duplicates from the original? So that's my first question that comes to mind when I see this question. So what are some other questions that people have about this question so far? I've only told you to remove duplicates from a linked list. What other questions do you have? Okay, what kind of data does this linked list node hold? Is it all integers? Is it strings? Because that could affect the way you compare these the data, right? Is the list sorted? Yeah, it's a really good question. If the list is sorted, we might have a more efficient way on detecting duplicates versus if it's not sorted, we might have to create a hash map instead. Can we use other data structures like a hash map, for example? Do we need to return the duplicates and keep track of what we removed? Everybody's getting really good at asking these questions. So hopefully what you're starting to see is that every time we're doing these exercises of understanding questions, you're pretty much asking the same questions, right? It's the same kind of pattern, and every kind of question only has a specific number of questions that you ask. It's not an unlimited amount. So in the first week, we were kind of slow with the understand step, right? We were trying to figure out, hey, what kind of questions do we need to ask before we start a problem? Now in our third week, everybody is just rolling with it, right? Everybody already knows the kind of questions that could come up, the tricky edge cases that the interviewer is trying to trick you with. And hopefully by the 12th week, you'll get so fast at every step of umpire that you can just blaze through. So that's the idea that we're trying to do by having you practice one step every time and trying to understand these patterns that you see for every question so that you just get faster and faster and faster at it. Because the key is really just repetition of practice, right? That's why we do this stuff so much. So hopefully, I already see it kind of from people. You already see these patterns that are emerging. Yeah, so let's say we don't want to return a new list after we delete the originals. So we want to return the original list with deleted elements. So then I say, okay, now that I know that that's what we have to do, let me write out the method signature, which looks something like this. So the method doesn't return anything because we can't create a new list, and it takes in a list node. The other question that someone already asked was, hey, what kind of data does this linked list hold? Now, do we know it's only going to hold one kind of data? Is it only going to hold integers, or is it only going to hold strings? Do we remove the duplicates and keep one of them? So if we have 111 or 1122, if we have 112, do we return 12 or do we return 2, right? Because it says remove duplicates, but it doesn't say, hey, remove it completely or just remove the duplicates. So we want to clarify that with the interviewer as well. Is the linked list always sorted? So that's something that we start to see a pattern of. We want to make sure that the interviewer isn't trying to trick us by giving us a really easy example input, right? Can we use extra space? That's also something that the interviewer is expecting to ask. So can we create a hash map? Hash maps make everything way easier, but a lot of times the interviewer will say, hey, no, you can't use hash maps, and that makes the problem a lot harder. Do we have to do it in one pass? Can we take multiple passes and keep track of all the elements we've seen already in a non-hash map way or somehow? And then finally, I want to clarify inputs and outputs, right? So given 1, do I return 1? I would assume yes, or let's return 1 if there's only 1. Given 111, since we want to keep 1 copy of the duplicate element, return 1. And then given 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, we want to return 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That kind of makes sense? Does anybody have any other clarifying questions? Oh yeah. So one pass, when I say one pass, I kind of mean, hey, can I just scan through the linked list one time first just to get an idea of what's in the linked list, and then come back and do something again. So for example, I might have a for loop that says, while the list node is not null, I want to take a pass to just kind of look at every element that is in the linked list first and keep track of that somehow, and then go back again and then remove the duplicates. Versus if I do one pass and I can only go through this list once. Right, if we don't use extra space, that means we have to do some magic with the pointers. And for example, where this 4, there's 2 4s here, we have to remove the first reference to the 4 and then point this 4's next node to this 5. That's what it means to not use some extra space. Using extra space would be creating a hash map to store the elements we've already seen, or creating an array to store the elements we've already seen. All right, so hopefully everybody has a pretty good idea of what you're going to do in the group exercises. We went through 2 examples together, and that's what you should do in your group exercises when you're doing it yourselves. So once we start the breakout rooms in a few minutes, you want to go into the course portal, click on session 1 for week 3, and all the questions are there, and you're basically going through the understand step, right? So I think we have 4 questions for you today for the understanding the problem. So you want to basically do what we just did, which is ask clarifying questions, write out the method signature, and then write out some example inputs and outputs that you want to clarify with the interviewer. And hopefully you're going to have an hour for this, so we're all going to come back in an hour. If you finish all the understand step of all the questions we provide you, go ahead and try to actually think about how you would solve the problem. So going through the plan and maybe even the implement phase for the question. So if you're going through all the questions and you already did all the understand step for the 4 questions we provided, go ahead and actually try to individually solve the questions there. So now that you understand it, try to actually solve the first question that we provide by yourself, and then kind of compare it with your group. I think it'd be really cool if when you go into your rooms to kind of turn on your cameras. I know it's kind of weird to turn on your camera when you're listening to your lecture, but it'll be a lot more interactive, and it'll feel a lot better if you turn on your cameras a lot less awkward, because then you can actually see people in your group, right? So if you're able to, please do turn on your cameras when you go into your breakout rooms. Otherwise, any other questions before we go into breakout rooms? So what happens if you go into your breakout rooms, before the hour is up, before we bring you back, you finish all your questions for the understand step? What should your group do next? Yeah, so if you're done with the understand step for all the questions, actually try to solve the first question. And if you're so advanced that you do all that and solve the first question, try to move on to the second question. So hopefully nobody will run out of things to do before we have to bring everybody back. Okay, so looks like, oh yeah, good question. Should you just make up answers for the understand questions if you're trying to solve it? So I think the group should come to agreement about, hey, this is the answer that I think the interviewer would do, and let's assume this is the answer and let's go solve it. Yeah, good question. Okay, otherwise, I think we're ready for breakout rooms. And if there are solutions to questions, so we only have solutions to questions that we do on Saturdays. And this is also on the same resources page that I'll send to everybody in Slack later. So unfortunately, we only have solutions for the problems that you work on Saturday for now. But if you have questions about the problems that you work on Tuesdays, feel free to ask in the Slack channel, the SE102 help Slack channel, and we can help answer your questions there. Yeah, so kind of just wondering what everybody thought. And I think the most interesting thing after looking at a few problems is I wonder if people have realized that there are some common questions that you should always ask when you get a linked list question, or maybe just any general question, but specifically linked list questions. What kind of questions are you finding yourself asking over and over for the questions? Like, what are some common questions that if you get a linked list question that you know, hey, I should probably ask this question as part of the understanding step? Yeah, I think the sorted one is always a good one. Like, is this input always going to be sorted, or what should we expect, right? I think that's going to be a very common one. If it's not linked list for arrays and strings, that's always a good one as well. Is it single or double linked list? If it's double linked list, that's going to make your life so much easier, right? So if you see a linked list question, maybe you should ask first, hey, is this going to be double linked? Probably 99% of the time it's not going to be doubly, but never hurts to ask. It does show the interviewer that you're aware of these different types of linked lists, right? So that's good. Yeah, should it be done in place? This is another common question for not just linked lists, but any kind of question really, like binary trees, strings and arrays. Can we do this? Do we have to do this problem in place? Can we take up extra memory? Yeah, so someone's asking, what does it mean when I say one pass? So imagine if I had a for loop that says, while the current node I'm looking at is not null, look at the current node, look at the data in it, and then look at the next node. So if I take one pass through the linked list, that's what's considered one pass. But sometimes maybe it would help me a lot if I knew like how long the linked list itself was, right? So for an arrays, you could say something like, hey, give me the length of this array immediately, and there's a function to do that. But for a linked list, you can't you don't have a function that says, hey, give me the length of this linked list, because maybe the question is asking you, for example, to get the to return whether the linked list is a palindrome. So for questions like that, it would be really helpful if you knew exactly how long the linked list was, right? And if it was an array, you could do that, array or a string, could do that really easily by saying, hey, what's the size of this array, or what's the length of this string? But for linked lists, you don't have that function built in for you, right? Because linked lists, as you remember, you can only look at the current node and the next node one at a time. So one of the approaches, maybe the first time that you take a pass through a linked list, you're just getting how many nodes are. You're just getting the length of the list. So that's taking one pass. And the second pass, after you already know how long the linked list is, then you do something else with it. So that's kind of the idea of taking a pass first, to maybe get some information beforehand before you actually start working on the problem. Yeah, so this kind of goes into what I want to talk about next. So I'm going to share my screen again. But just something else that I kind of wanted to bring up is sometimes you're in your group exercises and you guys might finish a little early. And it's totally okay to just like take 10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes to kind of relax and just talk about things that's not data structures and algorithms, right? I know 2 hours is a lot. And personally for me, I kind of have really short attention span. So if I'm doing something for more than 1 hour and then try to keep doing it, I get frustrated and I end up like not wanting to do it, right? So if you find yourself like, if your group finishes something early or something is being really hard or difficult, sometimes you could just take like a 5 to 10 minute break. You don't have to like really work hard every single minute, right? Sometimes it's good to take a break, take a step back and take a breather and then go back. So if you finish something early, it's totally fine to take a break. Maybe you finish one really hard problem and everybody take like a 2 minute break together, check their phones, get a drink of water. So you don't have to feel like you have to spend every single minute in a class doing something productive, right? Sometimes it's good to take a break. So just wanted to say that in case everybody was like really worried about getting as much done in these two hours as possible. So kind of going into something that's a little different to kind of take a breather, since everybody did just spend 1 hour going into intense LinkedIn problems. One question and one topic that I wanted to kind of talk about today is how to evaluate companies, right? So I know a lot of you are mostly thinking, hey, I just want a job, any job. I just want some company to hire me. But at some point, I guarantee you're going to have a choice between taking an offer from one company and a choice between taking another company. And something that I didn't quite know myself when I was looking at jobs out of college was how to actually picture myself at a company and picture whether I would actually have a good time at the company and whether this is something that I would actually want to stay at for a couple of years, right? Is this something that people are curious about, or no? Is this like a question that people have in their minds? Okay, this is hopefully useful for some people. So I just want to talk about what I do when I am interviewing for companies and how I decide in the end, like which company I think is the best fit for me. So the thing to remember is when you're interviewing, the company is interviewing you to see if you'd be a good fit on their team, right? But you are also interviewing the company. So you should always have in your mindset, hey, yes, I'm trying to get this job, but also I want to think about myself for a bit and think about whether I actually want to work at this company, right? Because taking a job that ends up being detrimental to like your mental health or something that you really hate can actually be like really bad for you, right? So you want to make sure that this is going to be a good fit for both you and the company. So something that I really like doing is I really like LinkedIn stalking people. So if I'm interviewing for a specific company, what I do is I go on LinkedIn and I go and see everybody who works at the company. So this probably works better for smaller companies, startups that you don't have as much information about, right? It doesn't make sense if you're LinkedIn stalking every single person who works at Google because there's so many, right? It makes a lot more sense if you're trying to go and see what kind of people are working at a smaller startup that maybe just has like 50 or 200 employees. So sometimes I like to look at, hey, for the people who work at this company, like what are their backgrounds? Are they like really senior engineers that I can learn from, or are they like all really junior engineers and it's going to be kind of crazy and chaotic place to work at, right? So I look at the people who work there and the companies they worked at before and how many years of experience they have. So these just gives me a good idea of, hey, these are the kind of people I'm going to be working with. Am I going to enjoy working with these type of people? Am I going to be able to learn from these kind of people? Am I going to be able to grow in this company? So seeing what kind of people already work there gives you a pretty good idea of those kind of questions. The second thing I like to look at is for the company, for the people who currently work at the company, how long have they been at the company? So one red flag for me personally is I'm looking at all these people who work at this company and they've only been there for like a couple months and there's nobody who has been there for like years, right? That means, hey, something was weird going on if this company isn't able to keep someone for longer than a year or 2 years. So I try to look for companies where people have a pretty long tenure at the company itself, because that's a good indication of whether, hey, when I go there, am I going to be able to stay at this company for a while? The second thing that's really, really helpful is reading reviews on Glassdoor. So one thing to keep in mind is sometimes when you read reviews on Glassdoor, it's mostly going to be people who have negative things to say, right? Because if you're happy, you're probably not gonna go leave like a happy Yelp review or something. But if you're pretty angry about something, you might want to go leave a review for that company. But it's a good way to kind of get a sense of, hey, what are things that people are working in the company right now don't like about the company? So I really like reading Glassdoor reviews just to get a sense of, hey, these are the things that I might have to watch out for. And if we see like 5 people complaining about something, then it's probably going to be something that's actually pretty prevalent throughout the company. Does that kind of make sense? People have questions about that so far? All right, feel free to keep typing your questions and I'll look back in the chat later. Some other things to kind of ask yourself when you're evaluating companies is kind of think about what's important for you personally, right? I think it's a different thing for everybody about what you're looking for in a job and a company, right? It could be a variety of things. It could be the culture of the company. Like, does everybody get to hang out after work together? Does everybody care about everybody's personal lives in this company? So what's the culture of this company like? What kind of people are in this? Are there like really senior people that I can learn from? Are there people around my age that I could possibly bond with? So some people care a lot about the people. Um, the third thing that I think is really important is personal growth. So, hey, if I join this company, am I going to be able to build up my technical skills? Am I going to be able to make some meaningful connections? If I want to eventually become a manager, is this company have a track for me to do that? So is this company somewhere where I can actually find myself finding a mentor and then being able to build up my career? The other thing is a lot of people care about is, hey, what's the work-life balance at this company, right? So are people going to have to work until 9 p.m. every day and then work on Saturdays? Or does everybody seem to have a pretty good understanding of work-life balance here? The company mission is something that is also important to a lot of people. So what is the ultimate mission for this company? And maybe you really don't want to work for a company that just sells ads, right? You don't want to work for a company that just tries to get as many people to click on their ads as possible. So company mission can be a really important one. Maybe you don't want to work for a company that's really just like trying to earn as much money as possible. You want a company that actually cares about its users. So company mission is a really important one. The third, one of the things that I don't care as much about personally is what kind of product is this company building, right? So for me, myself, I probably wouldn't want to work at a company that mostly just tries to build ads and get people to click on ads. But I want to build something really meaningful. So what kind of product is this company building? And one other thing to kind of think about is, hey, what kind of tech stack is this company using? Are they using like really up-to-date technologies? Or are they using like really old technologies that people haven't used for a really long time? So are they staying up to date with the current trends? So that's a lot of things. And it's going to be hard to find a company that fits all of these things that are important to you. So as you're looking for companies, you also want to think about, hey, if you're trying to rank these things, which are like the top 3 most important things that you definitely want in your next company that you work for? Or which are the top 3 important things that you don't want in a company you're working for? So kind of thinking about those things and thinking about, hey, what is the most important thing for you at this time in your life, and trying to tease that out when you're trying to interview for the companies. Any other questions about all this so far? The other thing is Karina, who's coming to teach on week 5, is also going to answer some of those questions like, hey, when the interviewer goes, hey, do you have any questions for me? She's going to tell you some of the good questions to ask to kind of get a better sense of how to find out these specific things. Yeah, compensation levels.fyi is really good to kind of figure out what kind of salary band most companies are able to pay you. Can you use reviews at Glassdoor to ask questions about topics that come from there? Yeah, I've definitely used that. So before I go into an interview for a company, I might do some research on Glassdoor beforehand. If I see something weird that's like, hey, people are always working on weekends and people are always working really long hours, I might not ask specifically like, hey, what's the work-life balance at this company? Because that's a very canned question, right? And no, everybody's going to be like, oh, the work-life balance here is great. But you want to ask like deeper questions to kind of tease out how they figure out if people have enough time to work on projects. So you might ask something like, hey, how does the company plan releases? So that gives you a better sense of, hey, do they have a pretty good idea of how to plan things so that engineers aren't burnt out and working too much just to get something shipped on a specific date? So trying to tease out questions like that is really helpful. How do you tell whether you'll click with the company culture or not? Yeah, that's a really hard one. I think the good thing is for most interviews that I've done, there's usually like a informal lunch interview, right? So that's when you do some coding rounds with some people who work at the company, and then you eat lunch with somebody. And that, I think, is a pretty good sense of getting a pretty good sense of, hey, what's the culture they're like? Just talking to someone casually, asking them random questions about what it's like to work at that company. Google does make most of its money off of ads. Oh, this is a really interesting question. Is it normal that companies allow you to work on personal projects or growth during work hours? I don't think it's normal that companies will say, hey, you should spend some time to, do whatever you care about for like 5 hours a day. So something that you could do at Google is you could spend 20% of your time working on something that outside of your current role. So that's something that's happening. But if you care a lot about personal growth and you're trying to see if the company can support you in that, you might say like, hey, like, how does the company support engineers who want to learn about new technologies? Or how does the company keep up to date with current technologies? Or how does the team learn something together? That might give you a better sense of how the company itself is trying to think about how to help employees. Can you do side hustles while working at Google or Facebook? Well, I guess me teaching at CodePath is a side hustle, so yes. Okay, cool. So Karina, who's coming in at week 5 to do the review week on week 5, she's going to talk a lot more about this. And she founded her own company, so she hires people herself, and she has done a bunch of interviews herself as well. So she'll give you a lot more insight into this. So maybe let this marinate a little bit for the next few weeks and think about what questions you may have for Karina when she comes in week 5, when she talks about this a little bit more. All right, so in the next session, we're going to go into the matching and planning phases of linked lists. So today we're kind of just getting warmed up. We're getting familiar with linked list questions, kind of just like reminding our brains like what linked lists are, how to work with them, what they mean. In the next session, we're going to kind of look at common patterns to solving linked lists problems, right? Because if you remember from the first session, what we talked about is a lot of times you might see like 1,000 questions on LeetCode, right? But you could probably boil them down to like 50 of the same kind of common questions that are solved in the same way. So for each type of data structure or each type of question, there's really just a couple of patterns that you have to know about. And once you know these patterns, everything's going to start seeming so much more easier. So this is where everybody starts getting better at the matching phase, right? The more questions you see, and the more questions you learn how to do, the better you'll get at recognizing these patterns and when to use certain techniques. So next session is when we're gonna actually start studying these questions and seeing these common patterns that come up for linked lists. And for a lot of these questions, there's also a lot of like common tricks and tips that you could use, right? So for example, finding the length of a linked list by taking a pass through the list first. That's a common pattern and technique that might be helpful for a lot of questions. So we're gonna go over more of those common tips and tricks and figure out when to use those and how to kind of spot them, so that when you see a linked list question, you can run through your mental model and be like, oh, okay, this question is kind of like this other question, so maybe I could use this technique to solve it. So hopefully you don't see a linked list question and be like, oh man, I have no idea how to solve this question at all. So that's our goal for the next session. But before our next session, there's a couple things you can do. So one, if you create your push profile, I think that'd be really cool. I was checking out some of the people who have already created their profiles, and it ends up being this really cool list where you get to see everybody who's in the class, and you get to see like what everybody in the class is currently good at. You get to see what kind of things that people want help with. And a lot of people are kind of looking for more buddies to do mock interviews with. So if you find that you want to do like a mock interview with someone, Pushflow might be a good place to get that started. The other thing is the donut community that I talked about in the beginning of the class. So if you're interested in meeting more people virtually, check out our Slack message for that and join the donut thing. And otherwise, there's really not too much to do before the next session except getting more familiar with linked lists. So hopefully everybody learned a little bit about linked lists and you feel a little bit more comfortable about questions, so that the next session I'm ready to just like jump right in and start attacking all these questions. Other than that, yeah, this was the end of the session. So feel free to leave and I'll see you Saturday if you want to leave. But otherwise, I'm going to stick around to answer some questions if anybody has questions about anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, Android at Google, we're trying to do everything in Kotlin now, but Kotlin is a very new language. So I do both Java and Kotlin right now. Yeah, the HackerRanks for this week and next week are both going to be on linked lists. This week's HackerRank is going to be on the easy side. So don't stress out too much about this week. Next week is going to be a little harder. When do you use a set versus a map or a table? I think it depends on the question. If you're just trying to see if like an element exists, a set is probably good. But if you need like values and keys for something, hash maps are probably better. I'm not actually sure when, at least for a coding interview, when I would use a hash map versus a hash table. I usually just use a hash map. See, there's 85 people here. Nobody's really asking questions. So then if nobody asks questions, I'm going to start asking questions. This is a really good one. I feel like there's pressure to have a side project. So I think this is a thing that's very common. Like, even though I'm working full-time right now, I still feel like I should have a side project, right? So I feel like there's just this constant pressure in the tech community that you have to be hustling all the time, right? And to be honest, if you're coming out of college right now, it is kind of difficult to find a full-time job for the first time. And having a side project does help a lot. So I would suggest having side projects. But I also want to say that once you get that first interview with a recruiter who's calling you, or that first technical phone screen, nothing really matters after that, right? It's really about how well you perform in this interview, at least at big companies. At startups, they might care a little bit more about your previous experience on your side projects, but at big companies, they literally only care about your interview performance. And your interview performance is literally just based on how well you do on these coding interviews, right? So if you're really, really good at these coding interviews, I guarantee you could definitely find a job as long as you're able to get that first call with a technical recruiter, which is what we're trying to help you with in this class, trying to give you those connections to get you started talking to companies. So I do also feel that pressure to also always like be working on some side project or something. And I feel like that is important because it does help you grow your technical skills. But also right now, I think the most important thing you can do is study for interviews, because this is like the best bang for your buck. You're guaranteed to be asked these coding questions at interviews at almost any company, right? So for now, I think this is best bang for your buck. And if you have extra time, I think having a side project does really help. Do I think Kotlin is going to take over Java in Android development? Yeah, so for those people who aren't familiar, everything for Android development used to be done in Java, and then this hot new language called Kotlin came out, and now it's all the rage. So I do think that Kotlin is going to take over Java in the future. But Java, I don't think is going anywhere because Java is used like almost everywhere. It's used in the backend, it's used for Android still, so I don't think Java is going to go anywhere. Yeah, this is a good question too. Like, what is the expectation that you have to create a linked list from scratch to solve a problem? I think you should probably be able to create a linked list. So you should probably be able to implement a linked list. Let me share my screen real fast because I was going to do the palindrome problem, but we didn't have enough time. But I just wanted to show everybody like what you should at least be able to do. So if someone was like, hey, how would you implement like a linked list node? So I would say you should at least be able to be comfortable writing something like this. So you should at least be comfortable writing the node class and like how you store the data in the next node. So you should be able to do this from scratch. I would say that's pretty reasonable. And you should be able to build a linked list from scratch. So if I had something like, so I was going to do the palindrome problem. So I did taco and cat. So you should be able to do this from scratch. So if the interviewer gives you a linked list problem, chances are you might have to build your own linked list. And hopefully it's not actually too hard, right? Just a couple lines of code. So I would actually try and practice doing this if you have, if you don't feel very comfortable about it right now. Is it common to use other data structures when solving linked list questions? Yes, absolutely. It is very common that you might need to use like strings or arrays or hash maps if you can when solving linked list problems. If we have an array with every element as duplicates, and you want to store it in a new array, what would be the space complexity? So if you have an array and every other element is a duplicate, and you're storing every unique element in the array, I guess the space complexity would be n divided by 2, given that n is the length of the array. If that makes sense. Not sure if I answered that question. Feel free to message me directly on Slack if that didn't make sense. Oh, imposter syndrome. Yeah, I have terrible imposter syndrome. I still think that I don't belong on Google, like almost like all the time. So I don't think this is something that's very rare at all. I feel like everybody has imposter syndrome. I think the thing to think about is if you're in your internship and you feel like, hey, this is like too hard for me, I don't know how to do any of this, and everybody else seems to be moving way faster than me, that's because they've been doing their job for like years, right? You just came into this company, just started looking at all their code, just started doing their tech stack stuff, and you're just really getting your feet wet for like a couple months, right? These people have been there for years. Of course they're going to be better. I would hope they're better than you. So you don't have to feel bad about moving way slower than everybody. We're having to ask a lot of questions. I think everybody expects interns to move a lot slower and to ask a lot of questions. So I would say try to ask questions, but also try to ask questions in a smart way. So I got kind of annoyed when an intern started asking me questions like literally every 5 minutes, because to me, it seemed like they weren't even trying to answer their own questions and they weren't even putting in effort to get the answers themselves. So then I kind of felt disheartened to give them all the answers because then it was like, hey, you're not even trying yourself, right? So I would say at least try to put in some effort to find the answers to your questions. And then it's very expected that you're going to have to be asking questions all the time, right? That's what interns do. So don't feel like things seem really hard because they're supposed to seem hard. It seems hard to everybody in the beginning. How do interviews differ from full-time ones? Yeah, I think internship interviews usually are way shorter than full-time interviews. So usually internship interviews, sometimes you just have to do like a couple phone screens, right? So I know a lot of companies just have to either score really well on a HackerRank test and then you get an internship, or you might have to do just 2 rounds of phone technical interviews to get the internship. Versus full-time ones, you usually have to go on site to the company to actually interview at the company and usually have to meet a lot more people Like you have to meet probably 4 to 5 other people and do these. So there's more rounds of coding interviews. And also they're probably going to ask you more questions other than just coding. How would you approach trying to get a full-time internship, full-time position at your internship? Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, I think it's always good to keep in touch with your manager, your mentor, your internship mentor about, hey, I'm trying to get a full-time position. Like just be straight up with them. Like, hey, I really want to work at this company full-time later on. What do you think it would take for me to prove myself that I can do this full-time after my internship? And hopefully your mentor is a good mentor. So being able to communicate with them like, hey, I'm really interested in a full-time position. I want to kind of figure out what I have to do. And hopefully they'll give you some concrete steps. Usually it's like, oh, like be able to prove you can help deliver features for the company, or be able to prove that you're able to work well with other people. So asking your manager, that's probably the best way to go, because that's probably going to be the person who decides if they're going to be able to offer you a full-time job or not. Is it wrong to talk about an experience in a bad way if it really wasn't a great experience? I'm gonna need some more clarity on that question. I think it seems weird, but generally I would say try to not talk as much about the bad experiences during an interview, right? You're really trying to show your good side in an interview, and you don't want to seem too complainy, if that makes sense. So the hard thing about interviews is you're getting judged based on 1 hour with somebody, right? Someone meets you for 1 hour and they have to judge you based on that 1 hour. So it's really hard for them to get a full picture of who you are. And if in that 1 hour you're spending 10 minutes complaining about something, like I'm thinking about that situation myself. And if I am interviewing someone, they spend like 5 to 10 minutes complaining about something, I might not have the best impression of them, right? So you only have 1 hour to give a good impression to your interviewer. And I think trying to spend that time wisely is probably something good to think about. It's almost 8, so feel free to leave. Definitely don't feel obliged to stay here for any reason. This is all recorded too, so you won't miss anything. Oh, HackerRank solution assessment. Yes, I will post that. Basically, it's on the resources page. So if you go to the course portal on the left side nav bar, there's this link that says resources, and it's all posted there. But I'll also post a link for it on Slack. Oh, if I had an internship, yeah, okay, so if you had an internship that didn't really give you a lot to do and you don't feel like it made a difference, like should you talk about it? Should you say that to the company? So I would say try to think about how a politician would spin it, right? Try to spin that internship in a way that shows that you learned a lot from it. So for example, I interned at DreamWorks, the animation company. I also felt like they didn't give me anything to do and I didn't learn anything from it at all. The way to kind of spin that in a good way is, oh man, I learned so much about teamwork and how the software planning process works, and I learned how to solve bugs, and I learned how to speak to people more technically so that I can help them solve bugs. There's always like ways you get to spin it, right? So think about your experience. I'm sure you got at least something out of the experience, right? So try to think about what you got out of that experience and what you could bring to an interview, talk about that. I would say it's probably not a good thing to be like, oh yeah, this internship was an experience. I didn't learn anything from it. I didn't get much out of it. It's probably not going to be as useful to the interviewer if you say, hey, this is what I got out of the internship and this is what I think helped me in my career. So think about the good stuff instead of the bad stuff. Is one internship enough? I think this is really hard, especially right now when there's so many new grads trying to get jobs. It's hard to say like what's enough, right? Which is like difficult. And I think that's what creates this constant pressure to do more in the tech community, because nothing ever feels like enough. But I will say that having one internship definitely increases your chances of getting an interview for a full-time position by a lot. It's really, really, really hard to get a full-time job without an internship before graduating college. It's going to be really, really hard. I'm just going to be honest. It's going to be super hard to get interviews for full-time positions if you don't have an internship. So having one internship really puts you way above the ladder for everybody else that doesn't have an internship. That said, the more the better, as always. The more internships you have, the better your resume looks. But having one internship, I think, is enough. Yeah, good system design. Usually new grad interviews don't focus a lot on system designs. I think in terms of systems designs, the kinds of questions that new grads might get would be questions like, hey, imagine we're building out a tic-tac-toe game. Like, what are the classes you might write for that? And what are the functions we might need for a tic-tac-toe game? That might be the kind of system design questions that new grads get versus if you're a couple years into your career, this kind of system design questions you get might be, hey, let's try to think about how we would build a web app or a mobile app for a hotel reservation system. So it's like different levels of system design. I think for new grads, it's probably way less common. I would say maybe like 20% of the time you might get a system design question, and they would be on the side of like, hey, if we're building out tic-tac-toe or if you're building out like a chess game, what are the kind of classes that you would make? What are the methods that we might need? So those kind of questions. Resources for that, I'm not sure. I could try to look some up and send it out to Slack if I find any good resources. What if the internship that you're doing right now has a really different tech stack than full-time jobs you're applying to? Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, the internships I did had literally nothing but the full-time jobs. I honestly think that because there's so many different tech stacks out there and every company does something differently, for every job I got in, I feel like 80% of the job I learned on the job. So I probably went in knowing like next to nothing, and I learned most of the job on the job. Just because a lot of companies do things very differently. I think there are some common things like using Git is probably going to be an industry standard. So being familiar with Git is probably really useful. But other stuff like what kind of frameworks that company uses, how they do specific stuff, like even how they track bugs. Everything is really different across companies. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think can you apply for internships as new grads or only full-time positions? I think some companies do limit internships to people who are going to go back to college, but a lot of companies also let anybody apply for internships. So the thing is, sometimes you could just apply for something, and even though you might not meet all the requirements, or even though you might not have the specific specifications that the role says, like you probably can get a call back if someone's looking at a resume. So I would say just apply to anything that you think you're remotely interested in and don't care too much about the requirements that are listed. So pretty much spam all the things that you think you're interested in. All right, I think the questions have died down, and it is 8:05. So yeah, thanks everybody who stuck around this long. I'll obviously be around on Saturday to answer more questions if you have any questions. But yeah, otherwise, see everybody on Saturday.